With today's congested roads, the chances of traffic accidents or damage to your car are increasing all the time. Unfortunately, so is the cost of repairs. First, the toolkit. An inexpensive and serviceable panel beating kit can be purchased at numerous outlets. The most useful tools are the heel dolly, so named because it's shaped like the heel of a shoe, and the pick hammer. This hammer has a flat face opposite a pointed pick-like end, which is used for tapping in those awkward high spots and edges where an ordinary hammer face won't fit. Perhaps even more necessary than the pick hammer is the flipper. This tool looks just like a bent file. When you're working with large or flat panels, you'll find you'll use a flipper and dolly 90% of the time. Your panel beating kit should also contain body spoons of various sizes. These are used where access is limited. A heavy hammer and a strong bar are necessities for most repairs. You'll need 2 or 3 pairs of vice grips to hold things in place, especially when welding, and whatever you do, don't forget your safety wear. A 2-speed sander polisher isn't very expensive, and you can't hope to make professional repairs without one. Body files are used in some repairs, a flat file for larger, flatter areas, a banana file for more awkward shapes. An orbital sander makes repair work easier and quicker. But if you haven't got one, a rubber sanding block and a bit more effort will do the job. Since most sanding is done dry, don't forget to wear a dust mask. Body filler is sanded using 36 grit paper. Buy it pre-cut and you'll find it exactly fits your orbital sander, or cut it into 3, fits your sanding block. Some plastic applicators and a can of body filler are now all you need to start work. Rust is almost unavoidable. The extent of the problem determines how a repair should be carried out. This door, for example, has been repaired before. Now it's rusted again along its entire length. Nevertheless, we'll repair it once more and give it a couple more years of life. Unless you plan to remove the door prior to repairing it, place 3 or 4 thicknesses of masking tape along the edges closest to the repair area. This guards against scratching during the sanding operation. Use a large sander with a 24 grit disc and sand the whole area. It's important to leave enough space between the paint edge and the repair area so that the repair isn't damaged when you feather the edges prior to painting. One of the biggest mistakes people make when performing any body work is trying to localize the repair. Attempting to keep close to the dent or rust spot destroys your repair before you even start due to the highs and lows created by the paint edges. Remember to keep the sander moving at all times. If you stop in one spot, you'll overheat the metal and risk warping and stretching the panel. If this happens, the end result will be worse than the damage you started with. Wire welding sheet metal requires experience and patience. Work stage by stage, a couple of centimeters at a time. The heat produced by welding expands the central hotspot, so it needs to be tapped down lightly while it's still glowing red. Then cool the area gently with a very wet sponge or rag. Wipe quickly across the panel until it's cool enough to touch. Then carry on welding using the same procedure until the job is completed. After resanding the welded patch, tap in any other rust spots before applying the body filler. If you don't have access to welding equipment, the whole repair can be done with body filler. Feel the panel as you go and tap in any high spots or rust spots so they're slightly lower than the panel surface. Your sense of feel is just as important as your eyesight. In fact, between now and the finish of the job, you'll need to rely more on your sense of feel than visual assessment. Mixing body filler is a technique you should practice. Resist the urge to stir in the hardener. It should be folded in until you've attained a uniform colour. This method eliminates air bubbles in the mixture, ensuring a much better final result with as few pinholes as possible. When applying the filler, once again, don't try to localise the job. Apply filler to the whole area, keeping it as neat and flat as possible, being sure to work it into all the holes and low spots. After 15 to 30 minutes, it should be hard enough to sand. You should use 36 grit paper whether you're using an orbital sander or sanding by hand. Sand as large an area as possible, lengthwise and diagonally. Hand sanding is just as effective. It only requires a bit more effort. Feel the area with the flat of your hand as you go. You'll soon develop a feel for imperfections at high and low spots, as well as the natural line of the body. However, no matter how expert you are in mixing and sanding body filler, it's impossible to get it right first time. You'll still find a couple of small low spots and a number of pinholes after sanding. A second coat of filler is invariably needed. Once again, don't try to localize the job. Apply another coat of filler over the same area as before, making sure you fill every pinhole and low spot. This eliminates problem areas that would ruin your refinishing. This final coat should be finished by hand, as the orbital sander will not give you a perfectly flat finish. We've now finished the repair, achieving a perfectly flat surface. We've kept away from the paint edge, and it's now ready for paint preparation.
This is typical low-speed accident damage. Not a big repair, but a lot of parts have to be taken off before we can repair the panels. Let's get to work.
When you remove anything from a car that has to be replaced with new parts, make sure you save all the screws and clips. Some manufacturers don't supply these items with their replacement parts, and if you use the wrong size or shape of screw in an indicator lens, for example, you could quite easily crack the lens and waste your money. This damage is in a particularly awkward place, and we're going to need most of our tools to get it back in shape. Remember, on this type of repair, you must restore the shape bit by bit. Start by bringing the nose across with your large hammer and body spoon. Don't be afraid to use a bit of force here. This is the strongest part of the guard, and it requires a lot of effort to guide it back the way you want it. This repair procedure applies to both front and rear panels. These are the areas that sustain most minor damage, but at the same time are usually the most difficult to repair. Removing the wheel allows access under the wheel arch, enabling you to use the large hammer and long bar to bring the panel forward either side of the center line. Don't try and attain your shapes in one go. This is a big mistake frequently made by amateur repairers. The nose is brought across with the body spoon as we go. Working bit by bit lessens the risk of overstretching the metal and the need for shrinking it back into shape later. At this stage, the reshaping of the panel is nearly complete. The hammer and the dolly are now used to tap in any high spots or bring out low spots prior to sanding and filling. It's almost impossible to finish a repair such as this perfectly. The aim is to get it close enough to the optimum shape and then leave just a thin coat of body filler on the panel after final sanding. As you work, keep offering up the new parts to check the accuracy of the shape you're developing. Once you achieve the rough shape, it's time to weld up any splits in the metal. The panel must be held as rigidly as possible before you tap it into its final shape with a hammer and dolly. When welding a strong section such as this, don't worry about heat warpage or the need to cool the panel.
We're just going to tap it up.
At this stage, the reshaping of the panel is nearly complete. The hammer and the dolly are now used to tap in any high spots or bring out low spots prior to sanding and filling. It's almost impossible to finish a repair such as this perfectly. The aim is to get it close enough to the optimum shape and then leave just a thin coat of body filler on the panel after final sanding. We have now formed the approximate shape. The center line is in the right position and the parts are fitting well. The panel is now ready for sanding, filling and finishing off. Use the disc sander in exactly the same way as described earlier. Sand an area well away from the repair with the same theory in mind. Avoid trying to localize the repair. When filling this type of repair, as before, don't localize. Use the filler liberally and work it into all the contours. It will ultimately make the job a lot quicker and easier. After approximately 15 minutes, the filler is hard enough to work. Use a banana file to further shape the repair prior to sanding. Pull the file towards you rather than pushing it. Using the same technique with the flat file, shape the flatter part of the panel and the nose section in turn, and once again, feel the panel to check the contour until it matches the original body line. Shaping is an acquired art, but with patience and common sense, you can achieve a professional result. When you've finished sanding the first coat of filler, you'll inevitably find pinholes and maybe a high spot of metal to tap back. This is the last point where adjustments can be made to your repair before the last coat of filler and the final sanding. When filling this type of repair, as before, don't localize. Use the filler liberally and work it into all the contours. A dent in the middle of the panel requires a flipper and dolly to shape it properly. You can see it more clearly on this cross-section of another guard with the same type of dent. A dent like this usually leaves a slightly higher ridge around its edge. It should not be beaten out with a hammer and dolly or the metal will stretch. If there is a ridge, it should be tapped down just level with the panel surface. The center is then pimpled out with the sharp edge of a heel dolly. Then the flipper is used to knock in the higher metal and bring out the lower part without stretching the metal. This is the method for any dents in large or loose panels. Applying the same method on this repair, you can see the panel stays tight, while it just takes a few seconds to beat it flat. The sanding and body filling procedures are the same again. Don't forget to keep feeling your repair as you work. You really need to develop that sense of feel.
We finished it.
The sanding and body filling procedures are the same again. Don't forget to keep feeling your repair as you work. You really need to develop that sense of feel. Use the filler liberally and work it into all the contours. It will ultimately make the job a lot quicker and easier. After approximately 15 minutes, the filler is hard enough to work.
Okay, so we've finished our repairs. Now it's time to prepare and paint our job. Here's the materials you'll need.
We need a can of primer, colour and clear acrylic. A spray putty gun will save some time during this process, but if you haven't got one, you can use spot putty applied by hand. You'll need roughly twice as much all-purpose acrylic thinner as the other materials, and dry rubbing paper of various abrasive grades. Also, 1200 wet or dry for wet rubbing the finished paint job prior to cutting and polishing. Almost any type of gravity feed or suction cup spray gun is suitable. The suction cup types are relatively inexpensive. Remember, correct gun control and technique is more important than expensive equipment. The only noticeable difference between these guns is that one has an air volume control and one hasn't. As mentioned earlier, a spray putty gun is very handy, but if you don't have one, spot putty applied by hand does the same job. An orbital sander is a very useful tool, but again, hand sanding works just as well. Wax and grease remover is essential. You must keep your job clean and free from contaminants if you are to create a first-class finish.
Before you make the attempt to paint any vehicle, don't forget one of these, a respirator. It's very important for your health.
Be sure to stir the paint thoroughly. Pigments have a tendency to separate and settle on the bottom of the can. The mixing ratio for acrylic is approximately 40% paint and 60% thinner. Some colours need to be thinned slightly more or less. It also depends on the temperature of your working area. Ideally, this will be at least 25 degrees Celsius. In any case, make the 40-60 ratio your starting point and add more or less paint or thinner as necessary. If in doubt, refer to the manufacturer's label. The fan and trigger adjustment controls are almost always in the same position on any spray gun. The top control widens or narrows the pattern of fluid exiting the nozzle. The lower control is the trigger adjustment, which regulates the amount of fluid coming through the nozzle. Practice adjusting both these controls, and also your gun control technique on some spare board or an old panel. Apply the paint in even, slightly overlapping strokes, approximately 30 centimeters from the surface. Keep the same distance for the whole length of the stroke. If your gun has an air volume control at the base of the handle, it makes it easier to set your air pressure at about 35 pounds per square inch or 242 kPa. The ideal fan pattern is as wide as possible, but with an even paint coverage through the whole width of the fan. Screw the fan control all the way in, the pattern is too narrow. Unscrew it slightly and the pattern widens. Approximately 2/3 of the way out, you'll find the ideal setting. Keep practicing your spray technique until you achieve an even coverage of paint without runs. The basic method for applying paint is the same whether you're using plain or metallic colours. However, some metallics tend to mottle when being applied. This can be minimised by holding slightly further back from the panel and applying a couple of quick diagonal coats. First one way, then the other. This evens out the metal particles, resulting in a consistent finish. Let's go back to the first panel job. It's now ready to prepare for painting. The first job is to feather the paint edges. The picture on the right is the unprepared rough paint edge. The picture on the left is the ideal feathered edge. To achieve this result, you'll require 150 grade rubbing paper, and whether you use an orbital sander or by hand, do a thorough job. If any scratches or bare paint edges are left, the first primer coat will tend to bubble these edges away from the panel, requiring more work. Then quickly sand over the filler to remove the deeper scratches. Next, let's mask the repair off with paper. If you're using newspaper, double the edges over about 7 or 8 centimetres to safeguard against paint soaking through. Cover a wide area around the repair and do it neatly. Tape loose edges that could trap dust, or it will blow out during painting and ruin your job. If your car has a centre moulding, use this as your masking line. This avoids having to blend the paintwork across the whole door. Before applying the putty, a thin coat of primer is required to give the putty adhesion. Primer is mixed at approximately 50% primer, 50% thinner, or according to manufacturer's specifications. There's no need to prime this panel right up to the moulding, as that will create an unnecessary buildup of material over the already painted surface. Let it dry for about an hour, then apply 2 coats of putty. Wait at least 2 hours between putty coats. Spray putty guns make life easier, otherwise do it by hand. Applying hand putty may be an art you wish to perfect. It should be applied with a plastic applicator in a similar method to the body filler. However, you must work fast, as this material dries quickly on the surface and is inclined to lift up again if you work over a section that has already been covered. Wait at least 2 hours between putty coats. Then leave overnight before sanding with a 150 grade paper on a rubber sanding block. We're now getting close to making or breaking the job. It's vital to keep your concentration and use the rubbing block flat on the surface of the panel. Then a light sand with a 240 grade paper over the whole work area. From this point on, there's no more need for a sanding block or orbital sander. All work is now carried out by hand. Care should be taken to avoid causing an uneven surface by applying too much finger pressure on the sandpaper. After removing the dust from the job with a clean rag, you should now have an ideal surface on which to apply your 2 coats of primer. Make these good wet coats, covering the whole area. You only need to wait an hour between these 2 coats, but then leave overnight to dry. Next, apply a very quick light guide coat of colour. Remove the masking from the panels either side of the repair and remask to allow for blending the colour in. Now sand the primer with 400 grade paper. The light guide coats show us when we've sanded every mark out of the primer. Take a Scotch-Brite pad and scuff the painted surfaces either side of the primed area to give your new material a key to grip onto. If you're painting up to a body moulding like we are here, make sure you leave your last piece of masking loose between the end of the moulding and the guard edge. This will help haze the paint in instead of leaving a sharp edge. The whole area to be painted should now be cleaned thoroughly with wax and grease remover. Apply liberally and dry off immediately with a clean rag before the solution has time to dry. You should now have an ultra-clean, well-prepared surface on which to apply the finishing coats. The first coat of paint should just cover the prepared area. Remember to apply the paint in long, even, slightly overlapping strokes, keeping the gun the same distance from the panel for the whole length of the stroke. Allow approximately 15 minutes between each coat, followed by 2 more coats, which should be blended further across the panels each time. By now, you may think you're almost done, but beware. Sometimes after the first coat, you may find silicone spots or fisheyes appearing on your job. Don't despair, there is an easy way out. A bottle of anti-silicone drops should be included in your paint kit for just such an emergency. 3 drops, well mixed to the spray gun, will solve the problem. But be careful when you apply subsequent coats, as the paint will dry slower and could run. Make sure you leave extra time between applications. With refinishing, the aim is not only to apply the materials correctly, but to match the colour as closely as possible. A lot of cars have some small parts, such as this petrol cap cover, that can be easily removed and taken with you to the paint shop, where the staff will be quite happy to match the colour for you. After approximately 30 minutes, apply 2 full wet coats of clear acrylic, again leaving around 15 minutes between each coat. You should now leave at least overnight, preferably longer, before you unmask and finish off. Firstly, wash off and leave the work area as wet as possible. Wet rubbing with 1200 grade wet or dry paper is of vital importance to the finished job. This is where we prepare the paintwork for its glass-like final finish. It needs to be done thoroughly with very soapy water. Any dishwashing detergent will do. Work over the entire painted area, just enough to take the gloss off. Be careful not to miss a patch, or you'll find that area will have an orange peel finish after you've cut and polished. After wet rubbing, wash the panels to remove any grit or contaminants, then chamois dry. Machine buffing compound has to be watered down to quite a runny consistency. It also needs to be stirred often, especially if you have a large area to buff. The compound tends to immediately settle on the bottom of the can if left alone. Apply the compound in dabs with a large brush. Set your 2-speed sander to slow speed, and if you haven't bought a new lambswool buff pad, check the one you're using. It must be clean and free from grit or in-ground paint materials, or the whole job will be ruined by scoring the surface. Buff the panels in long continuous motions. Don't stop in one spot. Buff the same areas over and over until the compound has disappeared. It's normal to have to buff the job twice. Don't worry about taking off too much of the paintwork. The 2 coats of clear acrylic will protect the colour. This job is looking fine. All that's left before polishing is to attach the pinstripes. On a job like this, stick one end in position, peel the backing off, move along, slightly stretching the stripe, and apply it in one length. Then look along the stripe, making sure you follow the nearest line on the car. Walk back, dabbing the strike onto the panels at intervals to hold in position, before running your thumb along and securing the whole stripe. Take a razor-sharp knife, Or for an inexperienced person, a pair of scissors, and very carefully cut the ends to the desired shape. Then peel off the excess. All that's left to do is to peel off the clear protection layer and cut at the door gaps. A quick coat of polish and this job is finished. But what about finishing off our other job?
Looking pretty good so far. The last job to do is put the moulding on. I'll show you a quick and easy way to do it.
Take care when applying body mouldings. Poor alignment is very easy to spot. This method is especially useful if you have to replace the moulding that was on the car when it was damaged, as usually the moulding will be slightly out of shape. Use masking tape to create a straight line. Take the end of the next moulding as a starting point, look along the tape, and follow on from the shape of the other mouldings. Don't stick the tape to the car, just let it sit there as a guide. Now peel the backing strip off the moulding, place one end in position and follow the line very carefully. Straighten the moulding as you go. Remove the masking tape, stick the cap on, and it's finished. With patience and attention to detail, you can achieve professional-looking body repairs that will not only save you money, but leave you beaming with pride.